Today on Twin Cam, we're stepping even further out of my traditional comfort zone. Because a few weeks ago, we looked at a little Wolseley 10, a car that very much bridged the gap between the interwar and post-war British motor industries, as car ownership was beginning to open up and class barriers were just about starting to loosen. But today, we're going much further than that, back to a proper 1930s motor car with proper 1930s pretensions. A lovely Wolseley Super 6. Although we have recently seen a Wolseley of this kind of era, let's start again with a fresh round of context. Because the likelihood is that the majority of you lovely lot watching won't even remember a Wolseley. So what does that light up radiator badge mean? The Wolseley Sheep Shearing Machine Company was founded by Frederick Wolseley in 1887, and that title shouldn't surprise you, as most of the early car manufacturers started out in life doing something completely different. But what will surprise you is the geography, because this symbol of middle class Britain is actually Australian and was based in Sydney. Enter a man named Herbert Austin. I'm sure you're familiar. As a teenager, Austin went off to Australia in search of engineering work and wound up supplying parts to Wolseley. But in 1889, Wolseley moved to England and Austin came home too, becoming manager of the Wolseley Company. Within a decade, Austin had branched Wolseley out and they'd started dipping their toes in car production. But with the two sides of the business doing very different things, the decision was made to split it into two, one doing sheep shearing and one producing cars. Despite them dominating the British market, by 1905 Austin had very nearly managed to bankrupt the car company, so he left to set up his own operations from scratch. Meanwhile, Wolseley was sold to the Siddeley Motor Company, and they continued to grow, exporting cars or selling knockdown kits to every corner of the globe. But the tide again began to turn, and by 1927 Wolseley was saved from receivership by another figure you also might have heard of, William Morris. Within a decade, Wolseley became a full-blown subsidiary of Morris, and even with a hard-earned reputation for producing high-class quality cars, Wolseley's became essentially badge-engineered Morrises. Fast forward a few more decades and Morris decided to merge with its biggest competitor and form the British Motor Corporation. So it's here we say hello again to Austin. After 47 years, Austin and Wolseley were the same company, and Wolseley continued to be used as an upmarket name for run-of-the-mill Austin and Morris cars until 1975, when the name was killed off for the sake of rationalisation. The final car to bear the name was the top model of the 1822 series, the car we all know better as the Princess. With all that history out of the way, we return to abdication era Britain, where the country was a wholly different place. Wolseley was one of the leaders in the early days of motoring, and with that came a preconceived market segment. Britain was, and still is, obsessed with class, so that's the easiest lens through which to see what I mean. Before motoring was affordable for the masses, it was the plaything of the middle class and the aristocracy. They were used by services. There weren't many cars on the road, and so a Wolseley had to fit in to that world. A Wolseley was a very, very respectable car, driven by the middle-class professionals of pre- and interwar Britain, the doctors, the lawyers, the law enforcement of that era. And while a Wolseley was never a massively high-end car, it was a market leader, and the Super 6 sat at the pinnacle of that kind of market. Despite Morris's purchase of Wolseley, it wasn't initially a part of his Nuffield Group, where Morris Motors was held. Instead, it was privately owned by the man, and over the following years he steadied the ship, readying it for transfer to Nuffield in 1935. Within only a few months, a new range of Wolseleys were launched, all sharing their major componentry with contemporary Morrises, bringing us to the car we have before us, a Series 2 Wolseley 16 horsepower. And with that nomenclature, you'd expect there to have been a Series 1 that preceded it, but there wasn't. That name was given to all Wolseleys of the period, purely to align them with the equivalent Morrises at their launch in October 1935. And these really reinstated Wolseley's position of strength in this big car segment, as due to finances in the years prior, they'd concentrated more on the smaller stuff. But they recognised the need for a car like this, not just to secure a future reputation for Wolseley, but also to act as a halo model for the whole Nuffield group. And part of Nuffield, this really is. Because alongside the Morris componentry and Series 2 labelling, the heritage is very clear in just the styling. Although it's very easy just to brush off the styling of all these interwar cars as being very similar, there are a number of Nuffield trademarks that carried over directly into the Wolseleys. Starting from the front, the raking of the grille is just as it was on a Morris. The horizontal vents for the engine are very similar to those on a Morris. The relationship between the angle of the windscreen and the leading edge of the front doors is just as it was on a Morris. The wheel arches are just as swoopy as they'd be on a Morris, and the design of the boot is just as it was on a Morris. For the sake of clarity, take a look at this Austin 16 from the same era. Unlike the Nuffield cars, they're much more upright, with a narrow grille, vertical vents, dainty wheel arches and a more squared off body. Morrises and Wolseleys were inherently swoopy, and this suits the character of the Wolseley down to the ground, because it gives it presence, with the big grille and all-encompassing arches. But this isn't to say it's merely a rebadged Morris either. The Wolseley, first of all, has a different grille, with totally different detailing throughout the rest of the side profile, with the bigger but more dignified vents and the additional swage line that runs down to turn back on itself and follow the wheel arch down to the running board, to name just a couple. It's a car with big presence, and one that isn't afraid of its status, but it doesn't flaunt it, especially in the black paintwork of this example. It's just rather handsome and very elegant. Although the Series 2 cars were only in production for 2 years, they produced 7 body styles, with a variety of saloon, coupe and limousine shapes being made available, all from factory. From 1937 they were replaced by the mildly revised Series 3 Super 6s, and with that change came a different style, unique compared to any Morrises, but a little more upright and, dare I say, stodgy than these Series 2s. But despite appearing all grand and elderly, there are some real niceties hiding beneath, because the Super 6 was all new, and with that came a range of overhead valve straight sixes and a 4-speed gearbox. Now, that all sounds really normal today, but in the 1930s, that was something to shout about, and Wolseley always had these kind of features, even using an overhead camshaft engine for a number of years. But with Morris as overlord, and finances always being an issue, they had to rein in the spending somewhat. But still, an overhead valve engine was a very nice thing to have in the day, as most cars were still using side valve engines as well as 3-speed gearboxes. There were 3 flavours of Super 6 on offer. The 16 horsepower we have here, as well as a 21 horsepower and a 25 horsepower. But that doesn't mean this one produces 16 horsepower as we'd understand it today. If you aren't familiar with cars of this vintage, that figure is the tax horsepower rating. So in the UK, the formula was based on the bore and the number of cylinders to progressively tax larger engine cars. So this sat in the 16 horsepower category, but produces around 63 modern brake horsepower from its 2.1 litre straight 6, with horizontally mounted carburettor dashpots, which isn't something I've ever seen before. The 21 and 25 had a different block to the 16, at 2.9 and 3.5 litres respectively, making either 86 or 100 brake horsepower. And any of those figures are pretty decent for 1935. But because of the way they produced their power and torque, the colossal weight of the thing, as well as the tastes of the period, the gearing is incredibly low. However, an 80 mph top speed is illegal today. As you'd expect, the 6s have a separate chassis and have leaf springs all round, and that's all pretty standard for the era. But what they also have is a bit of a marketing ploy by Wolseley in elevating the perception of their suspension above the competition. Because this is obviously tuned for comfort, and leaf springs do have a tendency to allow quite a lot of bounce and pitch. So these have what they called phased suspension. And in layman's terms, what that means is that they finely tuned the spring rates and the softness of the shock absorbers and the springs in order to reduce bounce and pitch as much as possible. The Super 6s then were incredibly British in their approach to both design and engineering, because while it's handsome and elegant, it is frighteningly middle class, and to go with it is a bit of genuinely interesting engineering. When we had a gander over at the Wolseley 10, we saw a car that straddled two eras. But this big fella is very much in a totally different era of motoring. And more importantly, marketing. Because what interests and amazes me is the quality of the language used in the adverts. This is Europe's most sumptuous car, and a silent witness that in the hands of British craftsmen, a 25 horsepower town carriage can be made a thing of shapely elegance and lithe grace without the loss of an inch of space or a decimal point of performance. For bulk is not beauty, it is the ransom paid to unbalanced design. That's worth a round of applause all on its own. And regardless of how wasteful big wings and running boards are when seen from today's perspective, that last line I will definitely be stealing. And it's a topic of grandeur that takes us towards accommodation. Because as I've alluded to, Wolseley's were respectable cars for dignified and professional folk. And even an on-paper deference towards the engineering of Morris wasn't going to bring down the tone of a Wolseley. Well, not yet anyway. Doing my best attempt to avoid getting my muddy shoes on the running boards, but we're in. Suicide doors again, they still feel so unusual to me. Anyway, despite the era and despite the fact that the car is of course very basic by our standards, the craftsmanship here is a bit of a work of art, because there's nothing like a heater fan in here, but instead the design is so very carefully considered and the materials are brilliant. So we've got this brilliant fabric headlining and all the wood and all that kind of stuff, and we've got the nice leather upholstery as well, the brown in this black on black car. But the central instrument binnacle, for example, has this brilliantly fine art deco design to it. It's absolutely fabulous to look at, and while it is completely obscured by this little oddment tray up here and by the steering wheel, the speedometer is square in shape, and it's all the numbers are very, very finely crafted onto the fascia. It's just so nicely designed. It's not like they have just decided to buy in an instrument and just stick it on. This says Wolseley inside it, and it's all very, it's all very coherent with the rest of the dashboard. It's just a bit of a work of art. And also, it's huge in here, and it's a big old car anyway, and no car of this era is going to be as practical as it could be just with the way they're crafted, the way they're designed. But in spite of that, there is loads and loads of legroom up here, and there's stacks and stacks of headroom here as well. In fact, we even have an opening roof, so that can become all the headroom in the world if you so wish. And just like the 10 a few weeks ago, we also have an opening screen. But as captain of this wonderful old car, you really do feel like a captain, because you can see out in front of you the winged W on the bonnet, really long bonnet. You even see one of the headlamp bowls as well, and you have this huge steering wheel in front of you. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a steering wheel any bigger than this. This is genuinely huge, but of course, big heavy car, about 1.5 tons, and of course definitely no power steering, so you kind of need this. But all the controls are quite oddly placed, actually. Even in this area, you'd usually find a lot of controls in a car to be placed not necessarily where you'd expect them to be, but them to be laid out very nicely on the dashboard. But while this car, of course, has had a life, things are not quite where you'd expect. So, for example, we have the key here next to you on the fascia, as you'd expect, the headlamp switch around it, as was very common for the period, and then above it we have the starter. But the choke is in front of you on this separate panel. So that's a little bit unusual. You expect it maybe to be in that instrument panel. But there is, of course, as is necessary in an old British car, there's a big, huge shelf in front of you. And we have little dinky wipers on the bottom of the screen. And also, I don't quite know how it opens. I'm going to guess one of the switches here actuates it. Or a pull lever somewhere. Maybe that one. I don't know. I'm not going to try too hard because, of course, it's not my car. But there is a vent in the top of the scuttle panel which will allow, obviously, fresh air in to circulate. But we do have wind-up windows. How cool is that for a car from 1936? But yeah, it's just a lovely, lovely place to be. It feels, even though this is a standard saloon, it feels like a limousine. It feels so very regal. Again, trying not to dirty the outside of the car. But in the back, I think, is where the main attraction is. And I'm going to have to try to stay in frame here. But this is seriously palatial. That's the most legroom I've ever had, most knee room I've ever had in a car, ever. And yeah, you sit here way behind the window line. As I've said in a number of videos, this is the thing that I love about old cars. It just feels so much nicer sat in the back of an elderly vehicle, because you have this great view sideways out of the car. You have these little grab handles as well, which are made out of rope, which is brilliant. That's lovely. And again, we have wind-up windows back here as well. Yeah, and I think this is where the main attraction is, because back here you feel like you're in the lap of luxury. There's nothing massively to speak of, but all the trimming is so very, very nice. And you sit in such a reclined position back here. It's absolutely tremendous. You even have a nice armrest on both sides of you, and you have a little cubby hole as well, which, yeah, I thought there'd be. Judging by the look of certain things that are kind of artifacts in a car, I thought there'd be something like this, and there is a replica, I'm guessing. Is that going to focus properly? Probably not. But that's a ration book from the war. Yeah, how fantastic is that? Yeah, none filled out. Meat, eggs, fats, cheese, bacon and sugar. How brilliant is that? Absolutely fantastic. There's two of them actually. So yeah, you have your little cubby hole, and you do actually also have, you probably won't be able to see this, but you do have pop-out windows right at the back. So I suppose the ventilation in here, despite having no face level ventilation, is going to be pretty good with the opening at the front, the 4 wind down windows and the pop-outs at the back. I could just say, sitting here, this is lovely. But of course it is the 1930s, and what do people in the 1930s do more than anything else? They smoke. This car has had a cigar lighter retrofitted to it, at least I can't imagine by the way that looks that it's original, but I have noticed that in the back here, on the edges of the armrests, there are these little, this one's a little bit stiff, but there are these little pull-out ashtrays, and again, I'm discovering stuff with you here. I believe this to be pre-decimal currency. Supremely awkward to get out of the cup holder, but yeah, there you go. There is a shilling. It's Elizabeth II era shilling, so I don't know what year. 1962. So, 25 odd years younger than the car, but there is a shilling. If you don't know how pre-decimal currency worked, you had 20 shillings to the pound, and within a shilling you had 12 old pence. So it was 250 pence to the pound. Today, of course, we don't have shillings, and it's 100 pence to the pound because cents eventually prevailed. The late 1930s, shock horror, weren't a great time to be building cars. Consumer production ended in 1940 as the factory turned over to the war effort. But Wolseley was battered by the war, with fires due to bombing and demand collapsing afterwards, with huge taxes and a decimated economy to blame. But with no consumer car effort being made during that period, the 25 horsepower Series 3 Super 6 did survive through to 1948. But by that point, this whole style was totally out of date, because it had just seen its course. Its replacement, the Wolseley 680, was a totally different style of car, much lower, sleeker and curvaceous, with a very clearly Morris-based design. Due to the era in which these cars lived and their age nowadays, very few survived. Most have led very turbulent lives and have their own story to tell. Only 65 Super 6s are known to survive by the Wolseley register, and only 3 of these 16 horsepower Series 2s are believed to be in roadworthy condition. 3. One day I'll do a video on how a car like this survives and how they see out their lives now as 86-year-old relics. But with that to come, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.